All right, everyone. Welcome back to today's Road to Wellbeing episode. So, the podcast series by Wellness 360, where we have real conversations about what it takes to build a healthier, happier workplace. I'm Samantha Levin, the Wellness Program Manager here at Wellness 360, and I'm really glad you're here for this one. So, today we're going to dive into a topic that honestly doesn't really come up enough in conversation. So, men's wellness in the workplace. So, the data is pretty clear that men engage far less with wellness programs than women do. And yet, most companies haven't really stopped to ask why or really what we can actually do about it. So, today we're going to dig into those barriers, the blind spots, and some real practical strategies for turning that around, including how to pilot a wellness program the smart way before rolling it out company wide. Joining me today is Brad, who brings real on the ground experience working inside HR and people ops. I'm going to let Brad introduce himself and welcome to this episode of Road to Wellbeing. Brad, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thanks so much, Samantha. Yeah, it's something that I just kind of fell into unintentionally. I was working with men B2C, just out there in the world, and a lot of these men who were husbands and fathers, and they were in horrible shape. They traveled a lot for work. They just let themselves go, and they all had a family they cared about. They wanted to be there for their spouse. And there was this little light bulb moment where I realized that when I was working with these men, they had benefits. They were saying, I don't need to get my blood work done through this company. My company actually has some sort of blood work included or whatever. And so, skipping the first 30 something years of my life to get up to this point, I realized about 2 years ago, hey, it looks like there's an opportunity to bring some of this work to employers and to help their employees because they need the help. They're coming to me for the help, and yet they're just not engaging in these programs that their employers are using. And so it's been a fun journey working with HR and working with some of these wonderful people leaders, helping them say, hey, you know what? I don't know if that's going to resonate or land with your male employees the way you intend. What if we swap this out, swap that out? And so the last 2 years has been learning about everything that HR does and all of the compliance and all the issues and all the things that really make it tough for wellness to be as effective as it could be because there are compliance issues. There are certain verbiage that has to be used and avoided, but it's been a very fulfilling journey because, you know, HR leaders are some of the most selfless people out there, right? They care so much about the well-being of others, which is why they got into that field. And so to work with them and see their employees thrive has been very fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that, Brad. I find really that interesting. When you work in wellness, you start to realize the availability and the utilization, just have become two different things, right? A benefit sitting, on use is not really a benefit at all. So, which actually brings me to why I think, the way we design and communicate these programs, matter so much, especially when it comes to, those who are doing the designing. So, I do find that there's often a disconnect. HR teams tend to be, 70 to about 80% of women, while a lot of the workforce they support are 70 to 75% men. What does that disconnect actually look like in practice?
Well, I mean, look, some teams are 50-50. It depends on
Yeah.
the industry. There's the fashion industry, there's PR, there's certain that are very female heavy.
Yeah.
And then you have industries like trucking and logistics and construction and these field workers and these craftsmen. And it is 80% men, 90% men. And so relatability is a very big key to getting influence, right? So when you think of an influencer or you think of these campaigns, let's say Nike gets an athlete and pays this athlete tens of millions of dollars to wear their shoes and wear their gear. And what you're saying is, I believe this athlete can influence tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people to buy our product because there's some sort of relatability there. I think the big thing that HR uh, you know, the big mismatch is that a lot of these industries where you have these 50-year-old stoic, traditional, tough, hardworking, old school American men being introduced to a program or an initiative by a very highly educated, empathetic woman, or it could be a man, but someone with a vastly different background and different type of work. Maybe they're sitting in the desk, they're in meetings while the men are out there driving trucks or pouring concrete out in the boiling hot sun all day, and so it's very tough in order to relate a program or a benefit to someone, saying, that's great for you, but that's not necessarily how we think and how we operate. And a lot of times what I see is that with wellness specifically, it's being sold or messaged as be healthy, be well, all of this. But a lot of these men are thinking, how will I make more money? How will I keep my job? How will I get my energy up? Will this help my performance? Those are the motivators that are in these men's minds. It's, hey, AI is coming for my job. Robotics are coming for my job. This is my priority. I don't care about health. I don't care about wellness. Yes, I want to be around, but I'm thinking in these terms. And a lot of times the wellness is, we care about your well-being, but that's not necessarily the top priority of these men.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, also just being in, New York City, that fast-paced environment, I see a lot of times, individuals I talk to, these men are just almost like go, go, go all the time. And, they're not really focusing on these wellness benefits and what's really offered to them. And, maybe it's, just, maybe that design problem, it might not be that design problem at all. It's maybe a language problem, because even when the right program exists, the way we talk about it and get it inside an organization can either open doors for someone or close it completely. And I think that's exactly, why, this matters so much in this conversation. So maybe, Brad, why don't you tell me a little bit about, if you could change one thing about how companies talk to men and, the way that they design these wellness programs, in their organizations, what would it be?
I think the easiest thing to shift, and it's something that any people leader, anyone in communications, anyone in leadership can do, is just shift the verbs or the verbiage, just change the language a bit. And you could send out different emails, you can have different flyers and communications, but something, even the word wellness has been adopted by a lot of self-care, beauty, skincare companies. So if you go by a day spa, they might use the word wellness. But what does that do
Yeah.
subconsciously to someone that sees the word wellness? If it's a guy, they said, "Oh, wellness. I think I saw that on like a shampoo commercial, or I think I heard that from the day spa." And so you might unintentionally turn a guy off if he's more masculine, because he's thinking of performance, right? Maybe he watches football on the weekend, or he watches the UFC fights or boxing or something like that, and he watches a lot of sports. Well, they don't use the word wellness too much in sports. And if these men are watching a lot of sports, well, what words are they using? Well, they're using performance, they're using strength, they're using focus, they're using longevity, they're using resilience, they're using coaching versus therapy. So a lot of times it is just the words that can be swapped out that will land a lot better. And that doesn't cost anything. That's something you could use if you're using ChatGPT or some sort of AI. You could say, hey, this is the message I'm putting out there to my team. It's not really landing the way I'd like. They're not really responding. What is a way that I can rephrase this so that this type of demographic, 40-year-old construction workers, 50-year-old truckers, whatever, would be more receptive to, and give that a shot? And that costs nothing, but it's just one of the fastest ways to at least test something and see if that is going to push the
Yeah.
needle in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, the verbiage shift itself is so powerful, especially in today's society. I see a lot of companies nowadays also do that switch from like wellness to well-being and, making them stand out. Now we are like, the center for well-being, now providing these resources instead of just like you mentioned, that shampoo bottle, providing these wellness solutions or wellness treatment, lotion, things like that. So I think that is a huge, powerful message, especially for companies starting up, providing these solutions to their men. Absolutely. So thank you for kind of mentioning that. In that note, and kind of, with this like tough it out culture for men, and I think, why do you think it's, a lot harder for people to ask for help? So how essentially does this tough it out culture, make it harder? And does it, are they just like, I can't access these solutions, or I don't want to kind of see, I don't want my HR team to see that I'm seeking solutions. Like, do you think, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of these men who have more of a masculine energy. So if you're not familiar with masculinity and
Yeah.
femininity, we have both masculine side, we have a feminine side, but what I found from my research is that most men will have more of a masculine energy. So if you think of it
Yeah.
like a plane, one is the pilot, one is the co-pilot. We tap into both, but just our home base for a lot of men will be masculine, which is this desire to provide and protect. We love it. We want to provide for others. We want to protect others and ourselves. And so a lot of times asking for help seems like it is contrasting that identity, right? How am I supposed to ask for help when I'm the one that others rely on and I take pride in that? Right?
Yeah.
So it's a very tough thing. And so that again, that needs to be reframed to the best way for me to provide and protect for myself and others is to acknowledge when I'm struggling early on before it becomes a bigger problem, before there's burnout, before I get rushed to the hospital, before something happens that disallows me from taking care of my loved ones long term. So a lot of times it's looking at speaking up about something early on as a strength versus a weakness. And I think back to athletics, where if a player is hurt and he wants to play through an injury, there's a question he has to ask himself, or her or she has to ask herself, which is, if I play through this, am I just being tough and I'm going to be okay? The injury is not going to get worse, or it's pain. It's not really an injury, it's just some pain, some discomfort. I can push through that and I can help my team. Or am I going to injure myself and then I'm going to be out for the playoffs and our team is going to lose because I'm being selfish and because my ego is leading the way versus what's actually best for the team? And that's just a very honest question. And you might need to ask someone else and say, hey, uh, there's a lot going on right now. I don't know. I think I need some help, but I don't want to be soft. I don't want to be someone that is like just crying about nothing serious. And if you ask yourself that question, you ask others that you admire and respect, then you should get a pretty honest answer. But that needs to be asked, and there's no shame in asking for help. We all need it, and the more of a provider and protector you want to be, the more you want to ask that question early on so that you're not out of commission long term.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not really about men, don't care about their health. It's just the culture that has become, around them and kind of taught them, that needing for help is a weakness instead of just a human, basic human need. I always like to say to everyone, I think everyone should talk to someone. I think it's so important. There's so much power and strength in, human connection. And I think it's wonderful, maybe at the end of the day, maybe you just had a new hire, and maybe it was you, Brad, you just hired someone new and they're lonely, just forming that connection with them, checking in, or how are you doing, to this company, because maybe they're like, I don't even know where to get started on all of these, wellness and everything going on. So before we get into the practical side, I kind of want to zoom out for a second, because I think there is a few bigger themes here that are really important for our listeners, especially, HR leaders turning in. You know, Maybe what are men actually struggling with, that HR and people leaders should be more aware of, from your, perspective?
I would say the big themes are that loneliness was announced as a public health epidemic
Yeah.
back in 2023, and that is across ages, that is across genders. However, research also shows that men are far less supported by their friends than women and tend to
Hmm.
lose friendships as they get older. And so the more you go down this rabbit hole of trying to understand what's going on with society. I thought we're more connected than ever. We are superficially more connected than ever. We can chat for an hour on Zoom. We can FaceTime with those around the world. It is incredible what technology has allowed us to do in terms of width, but in
Yeah.
terms of depth, our number of close friendships has diminished. In fact, there was a study done in 1990 where it asked a couple hundred male participants how many close friends you have, and you could pick one, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 or more. And only 3% of participants selected 0 close friends in 1990.
Wow.
They then did the exact same study in 2021, and 15% of participants answered 0 close friends in 2021. So that's 5 times higher, saying, I don't have any close friends. So male loneliness specifically is something that has gone through the roof, and we don't really have the institutions, we don't have the rituals. The way, when we're younger, we have sports teams, we have fraternities, we have sororities, we have all of these ways to build strong relationships over time, every day or every week for years. And when we're older, all of a sudden we move away for work. For men specifically, they'll rely a lot on their spouse for social engagement, and they might have a friend or two at work, but it might not be that deep of a relationship. And so a lot of times men don't have ways to really connect, and a lot of times it's physical activity or some sort of activities where they bond the most. So if a man is working remotely, he might not want to just talk to someone. He might need to go on a camping trip with a couple of guys, and then all of a sudden on the camping trip, on the second day, everything is being released. And a lot of men will
Yeah.
work that way. So I want to say, for HR and people leaders, understand that sitting down and talking, some men are open to that. They are good with that. A lot of men, they need the Trojan horse. They need the hiking trip. They need some safe space that's around an activity, even if it's watching a football game or watching the World Cup, for the all the topics, all the issues that are bubbling under the surface to come out. And I just did this post on LinkedIn about communication, about talking on the phone. I do not like talking on the phone, and I feel like a lot of guys do not like just talking on the phone. It was to the point where I looked up a prior phone bill of mine because I was thinking of switching carriers, and they needed to see a phone bill to match the price. From January to February, that billing cycle, I only had 34 total minutes on the phone for that entire
Wow.
billing cycle. It's crazy, 34 minutes. So
Yeah.
in terms of understanding, a lot of men, their communication a lot of times is through an activity, through some sort
Yeah.
of exercise, something like that, not necessarily a conversation. There is an identity crisis with a lot of men who like providing and protecting, but they're being out earned by their spouse, or they're just being laid off and they are lost when they don't feel useful. So men love to feel useful. They want to have a purpose. They want to feel like there's a place in society. And a lot of times, if they're out of work, then they don't feel like they have that place. And then on the physical side, one thing that's amazing right now is that I feel women's health is getting a lot of attention, a lot more attention, and a lot more resources going towards menopause, perimenopause, all of these health related, I guess, issues or concerns specifically for women. And on the
Hmm.
men's side, testosterone and our
Yeah.
hormones have been ravaged for
Yeah.
decades. And so this is the lowest level of testosterone ever. And I believe this is worldwide. It's not just the US.
Hmm.
And that's because of our lifestyle, our food
Yeah.
choices. We're not lifting heavy weights. We actually have to go to a location, pay $50 a month in order to pick up a heavy object and put it down, versus 100 years ago, that was just called
Yeah.
everyday work. And so that takes a huge toll on a man, mentally, emotionally, physically, what else? Sexually, drive, energy, all of that goes out the window. And I actually had low testosterone about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and I just felt horrible. So a lot of men could be in a really bad spot just because their hormones are out of whack. Just like if anyone's hormones are out of whack, they're not going to feel like themselves. And
Yeah.
so there's some very interesting things with men specifically. A lot more challenges are out there that both men and women really are faced with, but those are the ones that are really uh, you know, I guess ones that are men are really struggling with at this time.
Yeah, that's interesting. You just mentioned that. I previously just read an article that my mom actually sent over to me about how testosterone rates for men are extremely low than they were back in like the 90s. And it's just incredible. I feel like you kind of mentioned, it's not being talked about enough. And, like you got to pay the $50 to go lift heavy weights at the gym. It's like the foods out there that we're eating are, just filled with so many different chemicals, are just not the same like they used to be. And I feel like men just aren't feeling like themselves. They come home and then they experience, they're working all day, they come home, they experience these high rates of burnout, sitting on the couch, or maybe not feeling like themselves, not feeling tired, or maybe they're not feeling energized to go and maybe go for a walk after work, to cook dinner. So it's kind of just pushed on to maybe their significant other or their partner, or maybe a family member. So I think that that's a conversation alone that I'd love to keep exploring and talking about. But I know you kind of mentioned, and the data does show that men engage far less than women in just wellness programs overall. Maybe we need to create a wellness program specifically about men's hormones and exploring that. But practically speaking, how can HR leaders, actually get high rates of engagement from their male team members when it comes to wellness? So, as someone kind of, in the background creating all these wellness programs, what can we actually do to, grab their attention and have them engaged and stay engaged?
So I love this question because this is my purpose. This is my mission: is how do you get someone who knows they want to be better. They want to be a better version of themselves, maybe not for themselves, but for their family. They want to make more money. They want to see their son graduate high school. They want to walk their daughter down the aisle. And when I was working with these men before entering the corporate wellness world, that's what spoke to them. And I feel like that's the challenge, is that a lot of times this is the language that HR doesn't really want to tap into. And you might have to use some external vendors or speakers to come in and say, hey, this isn't about wellness. Wellness is not the end goal. Wellness needs to be the vehicle, right? Their end goal is, I need to be there to walk my daughter down the aisle. Being healthy enough to do so is the way I'll be able to do so. But a lot of men, it's not about health for health's sake or wellness for wellness sake. It is, this is going to get me there. So a couple things that have worked, and the best metaphor I like is liquid death. So if you're not familiar with liquid death, it is a bottled water company. And they said, how do we get 21-year-old college students to stop drinking out of plastic bottles, because plastic's bad for the environment, and to feel confident picking up a bottle of water at a house party while everyone else is drinking alcohol? So the way they did it is they designed their can, and I have a bottle right here if you're watching the video, with flaming skulls on the front. Their slogan is "Murder Your Thirst," and the whole point is that these kids were already drinking energy drinks. They were already drinking beer, and their bottle looks exactly like an energy drink or a beer. So a lot of the wellness programs out there don't really match the identity of these men. They look like
Yeah.
something their spouse would use. In fact, I was on an app earlier today. I'm not going to mention it, but it had a leaf and it had many women on the front, one man, as one of the testimonial pictures. So, or the stock images.
Mhm.
If you're a tough, stoic guy, you need to see something that matches your identity, which is, I'm a tough man. I work long hours. I care for my family. You need to see those versions of yourself in the marketing, in the brochures, in the packaging. It needs to be simple. It needs to be direct. And they need to say, this is designed for someone like me. Because if they're saying this is designed for someone like my wife, like my girlfriend, like that other guy in the office, they're not going to engage.
Yeah,
And so if you think
absolutely.
of all of these marketing campaigns, every single commercial, they pick specific actors that are representative of who they're trying to reach. If you think of a Taco Bell ad, it's always a 20-year-old group of friends eating the burritos together, because if you're 17, you're looking up at those 20-year-olds and you're thinking, these guys look young and fun and hip. I want to be like that. And a lot
Yeah.
of times there's zero aspirational elements involved in these wellness programs. So for one thing I like to think of is if you've seen the movie Top Gun, which I think most
My
men and women
favorite
have
movie,
seen.
actually.
Okay, everyone loves Top Gun. So I would say it's a more of a masculine movie, right? You have mostly men. They have fighter jets. They have all this, but I don't see wellness programs that are framed like Top Gun. Now, imagine, or the Navy SEALs, right? If the Navy SEALs said, "Hey, we're doing this wellness program," and it's the Navy SEALs emblem, a lot of men would probably say this would be far more work than I would ever imagine. But I have a sense of pride engaging in something that looks like the Navy SEALs or Top Gun. And so, we got to meet people where they're at, right? For a lot of these men,
Yeah.
it's going to be an uphill climb to get them to change several behaviors every single day for weeks and months until it becomes who they are. That is a big ask. So you better meet them with a sense of pride with these programs, because right now, a lot of the programs look like that clear plastic bottle of water, when what they need is that energy drink looking brand that says, hey, this is for someone like me, this is cool, and I now am not only going to do it, but I'll feel proud telling others about it versus kind of hiding it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of times in this wellness space, we're trained to kind of, make sure that, we're tailoring our needs to these individuals that we're kind of seeing. And I think a lot of people, fail to kind of realize that, there so many men out there, they might not seem like they want these services, but they do, and they need them. And I think a lot of people, are afraid to kind of, post these pictures of, these men maybe with all these muscles and kind of show that, this might be like a hidden gold standard, but, maybe we want to increase their testosterone levels. We want to make sure that these men are healthy, and there's no shame in that. And I think there's a lot of shame placed on a lot of, these individuals when it's like those pictures, like a Top Gun framed wellness program. And I think that's become a huge problem. I'd love to, now thinking about it and creating these wellness programs, start designing for those men out there, because I know so many men in my life, and I can, tell you, them working in the field, they're like, I don't do any of that. My dad's like, we have a wellness program with our company, but I don't access the services. I'm like, Dad, we got to talk about that. Let's unpack that a little bit more, and let's look at them, right? Being in the wellness field, I am a huge advocate for seeking services, and I love when individuals seek services, and I try to help them as much as possible. It, a lot of what you said today really stuck with me. And I think it's interesting, especially that liquid death. I had no idea. I always see them in the stores, and I've never actually, gravitated towards them, but maybe I will. I think that is a wonderful recommendation, for those individuals, or maybe you're an individual listening who doesn't drink, or especially on those energy drink take, to replace it with that, right? I think that's wonderful. So thank you for that note, Brad. This has really been wonderful. My last question I have today for you, maybe what does a smart, low risk pilot, actually need to have in place for work? So maybe like, you know, what do you need to start off with? From day one, I'm going in now and I'm going to kind of change and rework, maybe some of our wellness programming. What do you think is the first step I need to approach? Would you prefer, if maybe, or for our listeners out there, would you prefer if I go and, upload some of the photos, provide more research, reach out to these individuals? What do you think that very first step I should do, or these listeners out there should do?
Well, I'll answer that by offering my approach, which is I like to hand select people to be nominated, right? I feel like everyone feels special when they are nominated to join a pilot program. You've been selected, right? I'm a big fan of handwritten invitations, right? If
That's
you're watching one
wonderful.
of these movies like Top Gun or any of these, any
Yeah.
really a lot of movies, period, it always starts with a knock on the door. It starts with a phone call. It starts with a letter in
Yeah.
the mail, and then the hero's journey begins. A lot of wellness programs, what, a blast email, open enrollment, that is the exact opposite of feeling special in my ability, in my opinion, right? When I get something in the mail that's handwritten, I feel special. When I get a phone call or a voice message, I feel special. So I would say the first thing is that any pilot program, figure out where you want to start with your employees and make sure that the invitation is personalized and it's custom, because something
Yes.
like this, you're asking so much of someone. They have a busy life, they have their family, they have their friends, they're just trying to keep up. And to say, hey, we need you to take more effort away from something that is providing you instant pleasure, because this is good for you long term and it's good for us. You better make them feel special, or it's going to be a very tough sell. So I like to send a handwritten, or sorry, hand addressed invitation with a wax seal, something that would signal that, oh my God, I'm invited to something special.
Yeah.
Two, I reframe this as leadership training for the body, right? This is not wellness. This is leadership training for the body, because
I love
people
that.
are typically people are open to leadership training. They want the skills. They want to get better, right? Anything that can help them be better in their personal and professional life, a lot of people are open to, but wellness doesn't necessarily convey that message a lot of the times. So
Yeah.
that's the second thing. Two, there's a lot of elements that work really well out in the world that is not utilized by HR, such as scarcity and urgency. So if 100 of these invitations are sent out for a pilot, cap the pilot at 12, at 16, at a specific number, and make individuals self-select within a time frame. I'm a big fan of that, because all of a sudden, hey, look, we see this all the time with tickets that we buy to events, or there's only
Yes.
30 items left. Act now. These are human behavior, levers that we all are using
Absolutely.
and we've been used on. And so all you need really is buy-in, and these are the ways to get buy-in. But also, when it's something that a leader in the organization or someone that these people look up to outside. So, for example, if they are a bunch of truckers, right? It's a trucking company. Who do they listen to outside of work? Who are they listening to on the radio? Is there a certain podcaster, a certain YouTuber, a certain athlete, a coach, whatever? See if you can get that person to be the messenger, right? It might not, maybe you could bring them in for a training and it doesn't cost that much. And now all of a sudden you have a, a football coach who is now a commentator who these truckers listen to. Now this is the person saying, hey, I know you don't care about your health normally, but you got to be there for your family. Da, 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 da. In fact, you have resources in your company. Let's go and use this now. The messenger matters a ton. And so
Yes.
if you're in HR and you say, you know what, I'm a woman, I'm 45 years old, and these guys, we just are on two different sides of the spectrum. I want the best for them, but I know that I'm not the right messenger, because I could say exactly what they need to hear, but because it's coming from me, it's not going to land the way it should. Same as the other way around. If I try to tell a bunch of women something, I know that I'm not the right messenger for that, right? I can't relate the way that I
Yeah.
need to. So I
Absolutely.
would say, if you can't get someone externally, ask yourself who in the office, who is the most aspirational, respected person that these employees look up to and admire, and have that person be the face of the pilot and get them to actually give their input as well, because you need their buy-in. They'll, if
Yeah.
it's the CFO, it's a CFO, but it could just be someone who is mid-level, who's been in the company 20 years, that everyone loves and respects. Cherry pick that person, cherry pick a few others, and say, hey, we really need to work on improving our employee engagement with their health. And no one is looked up to more than you. They listen to what you say. Can you help lead the charge? Let's work together on this. But a lot of times you can mean the best for your employees, and you're just not the right messenger to that demographic. Maybe you could
Yes.
reach other employees who look like you, who went to the same school or similar backgrounds, similar work, similar education. But no matter what, and we see this all the time, you just You have some endorsement deals that do incredibly well with brands, and then others that tank. And we've seen examples of this. So make sure that whatever you roll out, you're using the right messenger to ensure that it's going to land the way you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's just a key message, for this whole conversation today, right? Like, back to that trucking, individual, maybe, you're not going to send me to go and preach maybe some, wellness programs and, advise them on specific, things, right? So you're going to send someone maybe that they can relate to more. I'm not going to go into their environment and tell them, hey, you all need to sign up for this challenge or provide them with mental health services. Maybe I will send an individual that, is within the company, or I can outsource, right? That's also another option here in case maybe don't have an individual within your company that you can bring in to provide these benefits. So that's also another option. But I do think that is a really important key takeaway, especially in my public health journey. That is something just from, moving and traveling and even being here at this company and previous positions, I've always learned, right? Not going to step foot into this, community and start preaching and providing all of these resources to these individuals without knowing, their background and what is really going on. I think it's best to always bring individuals, that they can relate to, that are within the community, to help provide these resources to them. Brad, I think this has been such a, valuable conversation today. And I think a lot of HR individuals and leaders out there listening are going to walk away and see this issue, completely different, right? Hopefully with a real starting point, for how to close that gap. And I think everything that you mentioned today has been incredible. And I really learned a lot just from our conversation today. So thank you for joining us. And for everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. Brad, is there anything else you'd like to, mention to our listeners today or anything else?
Please reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions or if this topic is of relevance to you. I'm happy to help. I am a speaker as well, and then I have my own programs that I work with HR to develop to help engage their men. But just a connection on LinkedIn would be great. I love seeing the faces of everyone. So email, there's not enough pictures, but I'm there on LinkedIn, and I'm sure it'll be linked somewhere in the episode, and would love to connect further.
Wonderful. And again, if this episode resonated with you, please share it to your colleagues or your HR team. Small shifts in how we talk about wellness can really make a real difference. We'll see you on the next episode of Road to Wellbeing. Thank you, everyone.